During the Great Depression, American grandmothers had a secret hiding in their kitchens. 30 desserts made from almost nothing. No eggs, no milk, barely any sugar. And yet, every one of them had something sweet on the table. Today, with grocery prices climbing again, these recipes are making a comeback. One used vinegar instead of lemon, another used stale crackers instead of apples. Let's discover the 30 desserts that proved hope didn't cost a thing. Here's number 1. In the winter of 1932, in a small farmhouse outside Muncie, Indiana, a mother stood at her stove with an empty fruit bowl and 4 hungry children at the table. There were no apples left in the cellar, no lemons in the house, just a sack of flour, a bag of sugar, a jar of vinegar, and a stick of butter saved for Sunday. She pulled out her cast-iron skillet and her one good pie pan, the edges worn smooth from years of use. Into a saucepan went water, sugar, and a spoonful of flour to thicken it. A splash of vinegar went in last, and a pinch of nutmeg from the tin she kept hidden on the top shelf. The mixture bubbled and thickened into something that looked, smelled, and, once it hit a buttery crust, tasted almost exactly like lemon filling. The whole pie cost about 8 cents to make. That's less than a nickel for sugar, penny of flour, and a splash of vinegar that cost almost nothing at all. 8 cents, and it fed 6 people a slice of something sweet. In today's money, that's less than $1.50 for an entire dessert. When it came out of the oven, golden and bubbling at the edges, the smell filled the whole house. Sweet, tangy, a little like a lemon pie, but warmer somehow. The children didn't know there was no real fruit in it. They just knew it was pie, and pie meant the day was still a good day. Water pie was the easy kind of nothing. Flour, sugar, water, vinegar, all things she already had. Number 29 pushed that idea further, into a cake with no eggs, no milk, and no butter at all. And it still had to be good enough for somebody's birthday. By 1931, on a farm just outside Sedalia, Missouri, the hens were laying maybe 1 egg a day, and that egg went to the youngest child at breakfast. The milk cow had been sold the year before. But it was somebody's birthday, and a birthday without cake didn't sit right with anyone in that house. So out came the recipe everyone in that era just called the war cake, or the poor man's cake. A recipe with no eggs, no milk, and no butter at all. Into a heavy pot went water, sugar, raisins, lard, cinnamon, and cloves, all boiled together for about 5 minutes until the kitchen smelled like a holiday. Once it cooled, in went flour, baking soda, and a pinch of salt, stirred together with a wooden spoon until smooth. The whole thing baked in a square pan for about 45 minutes, and it cost roughly 12 cents, mostly for the raisins and sugar. 12 cents for a cake that fed 8 people, with leftovers for breakfast the next morning. That's about $2 today for an entire birthday cake. When it came out, dark and moist and studded with plump raisins, nobody at that table was thinking about what was missing. The smell of cinnamon and boiled raisins filled the kitchen the same way a real cake would. A little dusting of sugar on top, and it looked just as special as anything from a bakery window. A birthday cake with no eggs, milk, or butter still had to taste like a birthday, and it did. Number 28 went one step further. A chocolate cake mixed right in the pan it baked in that actually fizzed while she made it. In a kitchen in rural Ohio in 1933, a young mother faced a problem nearly every household had. No eggs, almost no milk, and barely enough butter to grease the pan. But she had flour, sugar, cocoa powder, oil, vinegar, and baking soda. And somehow that was enough. She didn't even bother with a mixing bowl. She used the cake pan itself. Flour, sugar, cocoa, salt, and baking soda went straight into the pan and got stirred together with a fork. Then she made 3 little wells in the dry mixture, one for vinegar, one for vanilla, and one for oil, and poured water over the whole thing, stirring it all together right there in the pan. The whole cake cost about 10 cents to make, almost all of it the cocoa powder, since flour and sugar were already in the house. 10 cents for a chocolate cake that fed a family of 6. That's less than $2 today. For chocolate cake, during the worst economic years this country has ever seen. When that vinegar hit the baking soda, it fizzed right there in the pan, and the kids would crowd around just to watch it bubble. Into the oven it went, and 40 minutes later, the whole house smelled like a chocolate cake from a bakery. Rich, sweet, a little tangy underneath that nobody could quite place. Watching a cake fizz in the pan was the kind of thing kids never forgot. Proof a chocolate cake could still happen on the worst kind of week. Number 27 turned an evening, with no money for candy, into the whole family pulling taffy by lamplight. On a winter evening in 1934 in a farmhouse in eastern Kentucky, there was no candy money, not even a penny for the jar of horehound drops at the general store. But there was sugar, butter, and vinegar, and that was all a mother needed to turn an ordinary night into a candy-pulling party. She poured sugar, water, a spoonful of butter, and a splash of vinegar into a heavy pot and let it boil, watching it close, dropping a bit into cold water now and then to test it. When it hardened just right in the water, she poured it onto a buttered platter to cool for a few minutes, just long enough to handle without burning your fingers. Then came the best part. Every child in the house got butter rubbed on their hands, and they pulled the taffy, stretching it, folding it, pulling it again, until it turned from dark amber to a pale, shiny gold. The whole batch cost about 6 cents, mostly for the sugar. 6 cents, and it kept 4 or 5 children entertained and fed for an entire evening. That's less than $1 today, for both dessert and entertainment in one. The kitchen smelled like caramel and warm butter, and the sound of taffy snapping as it was pulled and twisted filled the room. Once it cooled hard, someone would crack it into pieces with the handle of a knife, and everyone got a share. An evening with no candy money turned into a family pulling taffy together by lamplight, laughing when it stuck to their fingers. Number 26 did something even sneakier, a pie made from a sleeve of crackers that fooled every child at the table.
Many of you have been asking where to find these recipes. We've gathered hundreds of them from the Depression era through the 1970s in our cookbook, Grandma's Kitchen. Complete instructions, pro tips in 10 chapters. Link is in the description below. Now, let's get back to the video.
In the fall of 1935, in a small house outside Topeka, Kansas, the apple trees in the yard had given almost nothing that year. Just a handful of small, wormy apples, nowhere near enough for a pie. But there was a fresh sleeve of crackers in the cupboard, and a mother who refused to tell her kids there'd be no pie that Sunday. She crushed about 3 dozen crackers into rough pieces and layered them into a pie crust she'd made that morning with lard and flour. Over the crackers went sugar, cinnamon, a few pats of butter, and lemon juice mixed with water, poured over the whole thing until it soaked in. A top crust went on, sealed at the edges, and into the oven it went. The pie cost about 15 cents, mostly for the lemon and the crackers, and it fed a family of 6 a full dessert with leftovers. 15 cents for something that looked, smelled, and tasted remarkably close to a real apple pie. Today, that's barely more than $2 for an entire pie. When it baked, the crackers softened and swelled with the lemon and sugar, taking on a texture almost exactly like cooked apples. The smell of cinnamon and browning butter filled the kitchen the same way it always had. When her children asked for seconds, she didn't correct them. A pie made from crushed crackers fooled every child at that table, and nobody corrected them. Number 25 carried a president's name as a half-joke, and turned the stalest bread in the house into dessert. By 1932, in a coal mining town in West Virginia, families had taken to naming their hardest meals after President Hoover, half in humor, half in bitterness. Hoover stew was watery soup made from whatever was on hand. Hoover pudding was its dessert cousin, and it came from the same kitchens that had nothing left to waste. The whole mixture went into a tin can or a covered bowl, set inside a pot of simmering water, and steamed for close to an hour. No oven needed, which mattered in houses where coal for the stove was rationed by the lump. The cost came to almost nothing, since the bread was already stale and would have been thrown out otherwise. Call it 3 or 4 cents for the molasses and raisins. In today's money, less than $1 for dessert made from garbage that wasn't garbage at all. When it was done, it turned dark and dense, almost like a steamed cake, with the smell of molasses and cinnamon filling the house. Turned out onto a plate, it held its shape, sliced clean, and tasted rich despite costing almost nothing. Hoover pudding turned stale bread. Nobody wanted to eat into something warm and sweet, named after a president as half a joke. Number 24 solved a different problem. Cookies, made with lard, on a week when every drop of butter in the house was already promised to the market. In 1930, in a farmhouse kitchen in central Nebraska, butter was something you sold at the market, not something you ate. Every bit of cream the family's 2 cows produced got churned, wrapped, and sold in town for whatever cash it could bring. But the children still wanted cookies, and a mother still had a tin of lard from the last hog butchering. She creamed lard with sugar in a yellow mixing bowl until it turned pale and fluffy. Lard worked almost exactly like butter once you got past, knowing what it was. In went an egg if the hens were laying, flour, baking powder, a little salt, and a splash of vanilla if there was any left in the bottle. The dough got rolled into small balls, flattened with the bottom of a glass dipped in sugar, and pressed onto a baking sheet. These cookies cost almost nothing, maybe 4 or 5 cents for an entire batch of 2 dozen, since the lard and flour were already on hand from butchering and the last trip to the mill. 4 cents for 2 dozen cookies. That's less than $1 today, for 2 dozen cookies that any child would be thrilled to find waiting after school. They baked up golden at the edges, with that sugar-dusted glass print pressed into the top of each one, and the kitchen filled with a warm, slightly savory sweetness that was different from butter cookies. But the kids never knew the difference, because nobody told them. A cookie made with lard instead of butter tasted like an ordinary cookie to kids who were never told the difference. Number 23 went further still. A pie made from the peels and cores. Most kitchens today would throw straight in the trash. In the fall of 1933, on a farm in upstate New York, the good apples, the ones without bruises or wormholes, went straight to market because cash from selling apples was cash the family needed for the winter. What stayed home were the scraps, the peels, the cores, the small bruised ones nobody would buy. A mother would take a big bowl of those scraps, peels, cores, and all, and boil them down in a pot with a little water until they went soft and broke apart. She'd strain the whole mess through a cloth, pressing out every bit of juice and pulp she could, leaving behind just the seeds and tough bits to throw to the chickens. What was left looked like apple sauce, tasted like apples, and cost exactly nothing extra, since those scraps would have gone to the compost pile otherwise. To that pulp she added sugar, cinnamon, and a spoonful of flour to thicken it, poured it into a lard crust, and baked it until the filling bubbled at the edges and the crust turned golden brown. The only real cost was the sugar and a little flour, maybe 5 cents total. 5 cents for a pie that used parts of the apple most people today throw straight in the trash. That's less than $1 now, for a dessert made entirely from what would have been garbage. The smell of apples and cinnamon filled the kitchen exactly the way it would with a proper pie, because in every way that mattered, it was a proper pie. Nobody at that table could tell the difference between a pie made from whole apples and one made from their leftover parts. Apple scrap pie made peels and cores taste, smell, and look like a proper pie. And nobody at that table could tell the difference. Number 22 was a cake that announced itself before you even reached the door. You could smell it from the porch. In 1930, in a Pennsylvania Dutch farmhouse outside Lancaster, sugar was something you bought in small amounts and guarded carefully. Molasses, on the other hand, came in a big tin that lasted for months and cost far less per spoonful. So when a mother wanted to bake something sweet for Sunday, molasses did most of the work. She mixed flour, a little sugar, butter or lard, and cinnamon together with her fingers until it turned into loose, sandy crumbs. Set that bowl aside. In a second bowl went molasses, hot water, baking soda, and more flour, stirred into a dark, thick batter that smelled rich even before it hit the oven. The batter went into a pan, and the crumb mixture got scattered thick across the top, pressed down gently with her palm. The whole cake cost around 8 cents. Almost all of it the molasses, since flour and lard were already in the pantry from the week's baking. 8 cents for a cake that fed the whole family after church, with enough left over for Monday's lunch pails. Today, that's under $1.50 for a cake that lasted 2 days. Baked. The molasses turned the cake nearly black at the edges and deep brown throughout, with that crumb topping turning golden and slightly crisp. The smell, warm, dark, almost smoky sweet, filled the entire house and drifted out onto the porch, where the children would linger just to breathe it in before they were allowed inside. Molasses crumb cake filled the whole house with its smell long before anyone got near a plate. Number 21 came from even less, a half-empty box of crackers and a cold cup of yesterday's coffee. In a small house in rural Georgia in 1936, the end of the week often meant the bread box held nothing but crumbs and broken pieces of soda crackers, too little for a meal, too much to throw away. A mother facing a half-empty cracker sleeve and a single cup of leftover coffee turned both into dessert. She crushed the crackers into coarse crumbs with her hands, right there over the bowl, and layered them in a baking dish with sugar, a little cinnamon, and small pats of butter scattered between each layer. Over the top, instead of milk, there wasn't enough to spare. She poured that leftover cup of coffee, sweetened with a spoonful of sugar, letting it soak down through every layer. Into the oven it went, just until the top layer turned crisp and the coffee had soaked the rest into something soft, almost like a pudding. The whole thing cost essentially nothing. The crackers and coffee were already paid for and would have gone to waste otherwise. Call it 2 cents for the sugar and butter. 2 cents for an entire dessert made from a half-empty box and a cold cup of coffee. That's a fraction of $1 today for dessert that started as kitchen scraps. The smell of coffee and cinnamon baking together was unlike anything from a store. Rich, slightly bitter underneath the sweetness, warm in a way that filled the whole small house. Served warm in bowls, with the crisp top layer and the soft, soaked bottom, nobody questioned what was in it. It was dessert, and it was good. A half-empty box of crackers and cold coffee became dessert because even the leftovers of leftovers deserved to be something. Number 20 went bigger, a way to make sure 11 people, all in one house, never went to bed without something sweet. In 1931, in a household in rural Tennessee with 9 children, bread was baked twice a week, and not a single slice was allowed to go stale without a purpose. By the end of the week, whatever bread remained, heels, crusts, dried out middle slices, went straight into a big bowl for Sunday's dessert. A mother would tear that bread into rough pieces and cover it with milk, letting it sit until every piece had gone soft and soaked through. In went eggs from that morning's gathering, sugar, a heavy dose of cinnamon, and raisins if the family had any left from the last trip to the general store. She'd stir it all together until it looked like a thick, lumpy batter and pour it into a buttered baking dish. Baked until the top turned golden and slightly crisp, while the inside stayed soft and custardy. The whole dish cost about 10 cents. Mostly the eggs and milk, both of which the family already had from their own chickens and cow. 10 cents, and it fed 9 children plus 2 parents a full dessert, with enough left for breakfast the next day. In today's dollars, that's under $2 for dessert and breakfast combined, for an entire household. The smell of cinnamon and warm milk filled the kitchen the moment it came out of the oven, and the 11 of them would gather around the table, each getting a square cut straight from the dish. No fancy plating, just a warm square handed over with a spoon. Bread pudding made sure 11 people in one house never went to bed without something sweet, using nothing but stale bread and eggs from that morning. Number 19 used the very same trick on a pot of rice, feeding the family twice from one meal. In 1932, in a small house outside Sacramento, California, rice was one of the cheapest things a family could buy in bulk. A 50-pound sack lasted months and cost less per pound than almost anything else in the store. A mother with leftover rice from supper and a handful of raisins in the cupboard had everything she needed for the next night's dessert. She'd take the leftover rice, already cooked, already soft, and add it to a pot with milk, sugar, a beaten egg, cinnamon, and a generous handful of raisins. The whole thing simmered slowly on the back of the stove, stirred often so it wouldn't stick or scorch, until the rice had absorbed most of the milk and turned thick and creamy, with the raisins plumping up as they cooked. The cost was almost nothing extra. The rice was already cooked from the night before, so this was really just milk, an egg, sugar, and raisins. Call it 6 cents for a pot that filled 6 bowls. 6 cents for dessert that started as leftovers from last night's supper. That's about $1 today for an entire family's dessert made from food that had already been paid for once. Served warm in bowls with a light dusting of cinnamon on top. The pudding had a soft, creamy texture, with the plumped raisins giving little bursts of sweetness in every spoonful. The smell of warm milk and cinnamon filled the kitchen the same way it had the night before with supper. But this time it meant dessert. Rice pudding fed that family twice, once as supper, once as dessert, from a single pot. Number 18 pulled off something similar with a sack of oats that was supposed to be feeding the horses. In 1934, on a farm in Iowa, oats were grown to feed the horses, but a 50-pound sack always had enough to spare for the family's breakfast, and on baking day, for something sweeter too. A mother running low on flour found that oats could stretch what little flour she had left into an entire cake. She'd pour boiling water over a cup of oats and let them sit until soft and swollen, soaking up the water completely. While that sat, she creamed together lard or butter with sugar and brown sugar, beat in an egg if the hens were laying, and stirred in the softened oats along with what flour she had, baking soda, cinnamon, and a little nutmeg. The batter went into a pan and baked until firm and golden on top. The cake cost about 9 cents, mostly the sugar, since the oats came from the same sack that fed the horses and cost the family nothing extra. 9 cents for a full-size cake that fed 8 people, made with half the flour a normal cake would need. That's under $2 today for a cake that stretched scarce flour twice as far. Baked, the oats gave the cake a dense, slightly chewy texture, almost like a cookie and a cake at the same time, with a deep brown color and a warm, toasted smell that filled the kitchen differently than a flour-only cake would. Some families topped it with a quick broiled frosting of brown sugar, butter, and a little cream, browned under the heat of the oven for just a minute or two. Oatmeal cake stretched scarce flour using oats meant for the barn, and nobody at the table could tell. Number 17 went looking in an even less likely place. a pitcher of buttermilk that would otherwise have gone to the hogs. In 1933, in a farmhouse in the Texas Panhandle, churning butter left behind gallons of buttermilk. Too much to drink, too valuable to pour out. A mother with a crust already rolled out, she pitcher of buttermilk she didn't know what to do with, found her answer in a single bowl. She beat together eggs, sugar, a little flour, melted butter, and a generous splash of vanilla, then poured in the buttermilk and whisked it all together until smooth. That mixture went straight into an unbaked pie crust and into the oven, where it baked slowly until the top turned golden brown and slightly crackled, while the inside set into something between a custard and a cake. The pie cost about 11 cents, mostly the sugar and eggs, since the buttermilk and butter came from the family's own churning that same morning. 11 cents for a pie that used up buttermilk that would otherwise have gone to the hogs. That's under $2 today, for a dessert made from what was, until that morning, considered waste. When it baked, the top turned a deep golden brown, almost caramelized, while underneath stayed pale, soft, and tangy sweet, that buttermilk tang cutting through the sugar in a way that made it taste richer than its ingredients had any right to. The smell was warm and slightly tangy, different from a regular custard pie, and it filled the kitchen on churning days in a way that meant something good was coming. Buttermilk pie turned the byproduct of a byproduct, milk, then cream, then butter, then buttermilk, into a dessert worth saving room for. Number 16 wasn't made for a celebration at all. It was made and kept ready for the worst day a family could have. In Amish and Mennonite communities across Pennsylvania and Ohio, through the 1930s, raisins held a special place. They didn't spoil, they didn't need refrigeration, and they could be kept on hand for whenever they were needed most. And one of the times they were needed most was when someone in the community died. When a family lost someone, neighbors didn't show up with flowers. They showed up with food, because the grieving family still had to eat, and a kitchen full of mourners couldn't stop to cook. A woman would take a cup or two of raisins, cover them with water, and simmer them until plump and soft, then stir in sugar, a little flour to thicken, lemon juice if she had it, and a pinch of cinnamon and cloves. That filling went into a double crust and baked until the top turned golden and the filling bubbled thick at the edges. The pie cost about 7 cents, mostly the raisins, which most households kept on hand year-round precisely because they were useful in moments like this. 7 cents for a pie that could be made any time of year, with ingredients that never went bad waiting in the cupboard. That's just over $1 today, for a dessert that was as much about being ready as it was about being sweet. Baked, the filling turned dark and jammy, sweet with a slight tang from the lemon, and the smell of cinnamon and cooked raisins filled a house that day, needed something warm more than almost anything else. Sliced and handed out on small plates, it gave grieving families something to hold on to, literally, in those first impossible hours. Funeral pie sat ready in the cupboard for the day nobody wanted to think about, made from raisins that never went bad. Number 15 didn't have to choose between supper and dessert. It was both, depending on how hungry you still were. In 1929, in a small house in rural North Carolina, cornmeal was practically free, ground at the local mill from corn the family grew themselves, paid for with a portion of the corn instead of cash. Wheat flour, on the other hand, had to be bought, and that made it precious. So when dessert needed to stretch, cornmeal did the heavy lifting. A mother mixed cornmeal with a little flour, baking powder, salt, and a beaten egg, then stirred in milk and a generous pour of molasses until the batter turned dark and thick. Poured into a hot, greased skillet, the same cast iron skillet used for everything else that week. It baked until the edges turned crisp and the top cracked slightly, releasing steam that smelled like molasses and toasted corn. The whole thing cost about 5 cents, almost entirely for the molasses, since the cornmeal came from their own corn and the egg and milk from their own animals. 5 cents for a sweet cornbread that doubled as both side dish and dessert, depending on what else was on the table that night. Less than $1 today for something that did double duty at supper. Cut into wedges and served warm, sometimes with a little extra molasses drizzled over the top. It had a coarse, slightly grainy texture from the cornmeal, with pockets of dark molasses running through it. The smell, toasted corn and dark, smoky sweet molasses, was different from anything wheat flour could produce, heavier and warmer somehow. Johnny cake with molasses did double duty as supper and dessert. Made from corn, the family grew themselves. Number 14 is where this whole list turns personal. What one mother did with 9 cents, a box of crackers, and a single block of ice for a little girl's 10th birthday. In the summer of 1933, in a small house in Springfield, Missouri, a girl named Dorothy turned 10 years old. Her mother had exactly 1 box of graham crackers, half a can of sweetened condensed milk that had been sitting in the cupboard for months waiting for the right occasion, and an icebox that held a single block of ice the family had paid the iceman a nickel for that morning. That was the entire birthday budget, and from that, her mother built a cake. She whipped the condensed milk with a little water and vanilla until it thickened slightly, then laid down a layer of whole graham crackers in a loaf pan, spread a thin layer of that sweetened mixture over top, and repeated cracker, cream, until the pan was full, finishing with a final layer of the sweetened mixture smoothed over the top. No oven involved at all. The whole pan went into the icebox, set against that single block of ice, and there it sat for hours while the crackers slowly softened. The entire cake cost about 9 cents. The graham crackers and that half can of condensed milk her mother had been saving, plus the nickel for the ice, which the family would have spent that day regardless, since the ice was needed to keep the milk from spoiling in the summer heat anyway. 9 cents total for a birthday cake, less than $2 today for an entire celebration. When it came out of the icebox that evening, the graham crackers had softened into something almost like cake layers, and the sweetened cream between them had gone thick and rich, cold against the heat of a Missouri summer evening. Dorothy's mother cut it into squares and set out 10 small candle stubs saved from church, 1 for each year, pressed into the top layer. There was no singing recorded, no photograph taken. But years later, when Dorothy was an old woman herself, she told her own grandchildren that it was the best cake she ever had, better than any bakery cake from any birthday after. Not because of how it tasted, though she remembered that too, but because her mother had looked at 9 cents and a block of ice and decided that was more than enough to make a 10-year-old feel like the most important person in the world that day. That's the whole recipe, really. Not crackers and condensed milk, but a mother who refused to let "we don't have much" mean we don't celebrate. Number 13 started just as small. 1 leftover potato from supper, and a roll of peanut butter nobody saw coming. In 1935, in a house in eastern Kentucky, potatoes were one thing the family never ran short of. The root cellar held bags of them all winter, grown in their own garden. Sugar and peanut butter, on the other hand, were rationed carefully, bought in small amounts when there was a little extra cash. But a mother with 1 boiled potato left over from supper found a way to make both go further. She mashed that single potato until completely smooth, with no lumps at all, then began working in powdered sugar, a little at a time, until the mixture turned into a stiff, smooth dough that no longer felt or looked anything like potato. Rolled out flat on a sugared counter, It got spread with a thin layer of peanut butter, then rolled up tight like a log and sliced into small pinwheel pieces. The whole batch cost about 4 cents. Just the powdered sugar and a small amount of peanut butter, since the potato was already part of supper and would have gone to waste otherwise. 4 cents for candy that came from one leftover potato. Less than $1 today for an entire batch of candy made from something most kitchens would have thrown out. Sliced into pinwheels, each piece showed a spiral of white potato sugar dough wrapped around a ribbon of peanut butter. And despite what it was made from, it tasted purely of sweet peanut butter, with no trace of potato at all. Kids would beg for just one more, not knowing or caring what held it together. One leftover potato became a week's worth of candy, and not one kid could taste anything but peanut butter. Number 12 came from somewhere even stranger, a snowstorm that most people just saw as more shoveling. In the winter of 1936, after a heavy snowfall blanketed a farm in Wisconsin, a mother looked out at what most people saw as just more shoveling and saw dessert instead. Fresh, clean snow, untouched, covered the yard in every direction, and that snow, combined with what little was in the icebox, was about to become a treat the children would remember for the rest of their lives. She sent the kids out with big bowls to gather fresh snow from the cleanest part of the yard, away from any path or footprints, while she mixed together sugar, a splash of vanilla, and canned milk in a large bowl. The moment the snow came inside, she stirred it quickly into that sweetened milk mixture, working fast before it could melt, folding it together until it turned into something thick, white, and creamy, almost exactly like soft ice cream. The cost was close to nothing, a little sugar, a small splash of canned milk that was already in the house, and snow that fell from the sky for free. Call it 3 cents for an entire bowl that served the whole family. 3 cents for ice cream in the middle of the Great Depression. Less than 50 cents today for dessert that cost almost nothing but a little sugar and some quick hands. Served immediately, before it could melt, it had a light, fluffy texture, cold and sweet, with a faint, clean taste of fresh snow underneath the vanilla and milk. The kids would eat it on the back porch. In 1932, in a small house in rural Maine, a mother facing a kitchen with almost no special ingredients at all. No chocolate, no spices beyond cinnamon, no fruit in the house. Made a plain white cake using just flour, sugar, butter, milk, baking powder, and an egg. On its own, it was about as plain as dessert could get. But plain wasn't the end of the story. While the cake baked, she made a sauce, just butter, sugar, and a little water or milk, simmered together until it turned into something between a syrup and a thin caramel, sometimes with a few drops of vanilla, or a spoonful of cocoa if there was any in the tin. The moment the cake came out of the oven, still warm, she cut it into squares right in the pan and poured that hot sauce directly over each piece at the table. The whole thing, cake and sauce together, cost about 7 cents, since everything came from the basic pantry staples already on hand. 7 cents for a dessert that, with one extra step, turned a plain cake into something that felt like it came from a restaurant. Just over $1 today for what felt like 2 desserts in one. The moment that hot sauce hit the warm cake, it soaked in slightly at the edges while staying glossy on top, and the smell of warm butter and sugar filled the kitchen in a way that plain cake alone never could. Served immediately, while both cake and sauce were still warm, it had a softness and richness that belied how little it had cost. Cottage pudding proved a plain cake was never really finished. It was just waiting for one more step. Number 10 was a cake that only came out of the oven when somebody special was coming, and that's exactly what made it special. In 1934, in a house in rural Alabama, dried prunes were one of the few fruits a family could keep on hand year-round without spoiling, without an icebox, without anything but a jar on the shelf. For special occasions, a visiting relative, a good harvest, a holiday, prunes became the centerpiece of a cake that tasted far richer than its ingredients suggested. A mother would simmer chopped prunes in a little water until soft, then mix that into a batter of flour, sugar, oil, or melted lard, eggs, buttermilk, and a generous mix of cinnamon, allspice, and nutmeg, the kind of spice combination usually saved for special days. The prunes added natural sweetness and moisture, meaning less sugar was needed overall, which mattered when sugar was rationed by the cup. The cake cost about 13 cents, mostly for the prunes and spices, both of which were considered a bit of an extravagance for an everyday cake. 13 cents for a cake dense, moist, and fragrant enough to serve to company without apology. Just over $2 today for a cake good enough for guests. Baked, the cake turned a deep brown, almost black at the edges, dense and moist in a way that kept it fresh for days. Useful when company might stay through the weekend. Sometimes topped with a simple buttermilk glaze poured over while still warm, it had a richness that surprised people who didn't know prunes were involved at all. Prune cake came out only on the days that mattered, which is exactly what made it feel like more than an everyday cake. Number 9 went further, a cake whose most important ingredient never cost a single cent because the family grew, pressed, and boiled it themselves. In 1930, across much of the rural South, families grew their own sorghum cane and pressed it themselves every fall, boiling the juice down into a thick, dark syrup that lasted the entire year. Sorghum syrup was cheaper than molasses bought at the store, and for many families it was free, grown, pressed, and boiled on their own land. A mother would mix sorghum syrup with melted butter or lard, beaten eggs, buttermilk, flour, baking soda, and a heavy dose of ginger and cinnamon, creating a batter that was darker and more fragrant than almost any other cake in her recipe box. The sorghum gave the cake a distinct, slightly smoky sweetness that store-bought molasses couldn't quite match, because the sorghum itself was free. Made from cane the family grew and pressed at the community mill each fall. The cake cost almost nothing, beyond the flour and a little butter. Call it 6 cents. 6 cents for a cake made from a sweetener the family produced entirely themselves. Under $1 today for a cake whose main ingredient never cost a cent. Baked, the cake turned nearly black, dense and moist, with a deep, almost spiced sweetness from the sorghum and ginger together. The smell filled the kitchen with something earthier and richer than a sugar cake, almost smoky, almost like the bonfire smell from the cane-pressing days each fall. Sorghum syrup cake carried an entire fall harvest into the middle of winter in a single slice. Number 8 did something similar with popcorn from the garden, turning it, one night a year, into candy and into gifts. In 1931, in a small house in rural Illinois, popcorn was grown in the family's own garden, dried, and stored in sacks that lasted the whole winter, practically free and endlessly available. For holidays, especially Christmas, that free popcorn became the base for one of the few candy treats most families could afford to make in bulk. A mother would pop big batches of corn over the stove, picking out any unpopped kernels, while a pot of molasses, sugar, and a little butter boiled down into a thick syrup on the back burner. Once that syrup reached the right stage, tested with a drop in cold water, she poured it over the popcorn in a big bowl and stirred quickly, working before it cooled too much to handle. Then came the part the kids waited for all year. With buttered hands, everyone shaped the sticky popcorn into balls, working fast before the molasses set. The whole batch cost about 10 cents, mostly the molasses and a little sugar, since the popcorn and butter came from their own garden and churning. 10 cents for enough popcorn balls to fill a basket for the whole family, with extras to give as small gifts to neighbors. under $2 today for an entire holiday's worth of homemade candy. Each ball, once set, held its shape, popcorn bound together by that dark, sticky molasses coating, sweet with a slight bitterness underneath that cut the sugar nicely. Wrapped in waxed paper and tied with string, they doubled as both treat and small gift. Each ball, once set, held its shape, popcorn bound together by that dark, sticky molasses coat, sweet with a slight bitterness underneath that cut the sugar nicely. Wrapped in waxed paper and tied with string, they doubled as both treat and small gift. A free crop from the garden became candy for the family and gifts for the neighbor once a year. Number 7 did the same trick with a cash crop, peanuts that were supposed to be sold. In 1937, in a small house in rural Arkansas, peanuts were a cash crop for many families, grown, harvested, and sold by the sack, but always with a portion kept back for the family's own use. Peanut butter, ground at home with a hand mill, was one of the few luck breads a poor family could actually produce. A mother would combine sugar, a little milk or water, and a spoonful of lard in a pot, boiling it until it reached the softball stage. Tested again with a drop in cold water. Off the heat, she'd stir in a generous amount of homemade peanut butter and a splash of vanilla, beating the mixture until it thickened and lost its shine, then poured it into a shallow pan to set. The whole batch cost about 12 cents, mostly the sugar. Since the peanut butter came from peanuts the family grew themselves, and the lard was already on hand from the last butchering. 12 cents for a full pan of fudge that could be cut into dozen small squares. Just over $2 today, candy made almost entirely from one crop the family grew on their own land. Once set and cut into squares, the fudge had a slightly grainy texture from the sugar crystal and a deep peanut flavor that store-bought candy couldn't match, since it used real, freshly ground peanuts rather than processed peanut butter. The smell while it cooked, sugar and peanuts together, filled the kitchen with something close to a candy. Peanut butter fudge let a family keep something from their own peanut crop for themselves. No selling involved. Number 6 built an entire dessert from two things most kitchens today would throw straight in the bin: soft apple, stale bread. In the fall of 1933, a house in rural Vermont, apple harvest meant bushels of apple, far more than any family could eat fresh, or even can before they went bad. Once the best apples were sold, canned, or dried for winter, what remained were the apples too soft, too bruised, or too numerous to do anything else. Apple Brown Betty used exactly those apples. A mother would peel and slice the softest apples, layering them in a baking dish, breadcrumbs made from the week's stale bread end, alternating layers of apple and crumb, with sugar, cinnamon, and small pats of butter scattered between each layer. The top layer was always breadcrumb, dotted generously with butter so it would crisp up in the oven. The whole dish cost about 8 cents, mostly the sugar and butter, since the apples were essentially free, being the ones that wouldn't have sold or stored anyway, and the breadcrumbs came from bread that would have otherwise gone stale and gone to waste. 8 cents for a dessert that used up two things: soft apples and old bread, that most kitchens today would simply throw out. Under $1.50 now for what was essentially made from leftover, baked until the apples turned soft and the breadcrumb topping turned deep golden brown and crisp. The smell of apple, cinnamon, and browning butter filled the entire house. The same smell as apple pie, but heartier, with that crisp crumb topping giving texture that pie crust alone couldn't match. The apples nobody wanted to sell, and the bread nobody wanted to eat, became something the whole family looked forward to all season. Number 5 used the strangest ingredient on this entire list. In 1936, canned tomato soup had become a pantry staple in many American homes. Cheap, filling, and versatile. In a house in rural Michigan, a mother with a single can of tomato soup and a kitchen low on both eggs and milk found that the soup itself could replace both and turn into something nobody would guess was made from soup at all. She mixed flour, sugar, baking soda, and a heavy dose of cinnamon, clove, and nutmeg with shortening, then stirred in a full can of tomato soup straight from the can, along with raisin, chopped nut if either was on hand. The soup added moisture, a little natural sweet, and a deep red-orange color to the batter, and crucially meant the recipe needed no eggs and no milk at all. The cake cost about 9 cents, almost entirely the can of tomato soup itself, with the spices and sugar already in the pan. 9 cents for a cake that replaced 2 expensive ingredients with 1 cheap, shelf-stable can. Less than $2 today for a cake that solved an empty icebox problem entirely. Baked, the cake turned a deep, rich color, dense and moist, with a spiced sweetness that masked any hint of tomato completely. Most people who ate it had no idea what was in it, unless they were told. And even then, many didn't believe it until they saw the empty can themselves. Tomato soup cake solved an empty icebox with a can nobody would guess was even in there. Number 4 wasn't made by one family at all. It was the night an entire town showed up, hands sticky for dessert. In small towns across the rural Midwest through the 1930s, a taffy pull was one of the few forms of entertainment that cost almost nothing and brought an entire community together at a church social, after a barn raising, or simply on a Friday night when families needed something to look forward. One family would supply the ingredients: molasses, sugar, butter, and a little vinegar, boiled together in a large pot until it reached the hard ball stage, then poured out onto buttered platters or marble slabs to cool just enough to handle. Then came the pulling. Pairs of people, hands butter, would stretch the taffy between them, folding and pulling, working it back and forth until it turned from dark molasses brown to a pale, almost golden color, full of tiny air pockets that made it light and chewy. The cost for an entire gathering's worth of taffy came to about 15 cents, split often between 2 or 3 families, who each contributed a little sugar or molasses. 15 cents for an evening's entertainment for an entire community, plus candy for everyone to take home. Just over $2 today for what amounted to a whole social event. Once pulled to the right color and texture, the taffy got twisted into rope and cut into bite-sized with scissors, wrapped in waxed paper by whoever's hands were free. The smell of molasses and butter filled whatever building hosted the pull: a church base, a barn, somebody's kitchen, and the sound of taffy snapping as it was cut filled the room along with laughter and conversation. A molasses taffy pull proved that community didn't cost money, just sugar, butter, and people willing to show up. Number 3 solved a problem almost every house faced at least once: no fresh milk at all. By 1938, powdered milk had become common in many households, cheaper than fresh milk, and it didn't spoil, which mattered in houses without reliable refrigeration. In a small house in rural Oregon, a mother facing a kitchen with no fresh milk at all, but a tin of powdered milk in the cupboard, made a custard pie that tasted exactly like the ones made with fresh cream. She mixed powdered milk with water according to the directions on the tin, then whisked that reconstituted milk with egg, sugar, vanilla, and a pinch of nutmeg until smooth, pouring the mixture into an unbaked pie crust. The pie baked slowly at a low temperature until the custard set just firm enough to hold a knife's edge while still trembling slightly in the center. The cost came to about 10 cents, mostly the eggs and sugar, since the powdered milk, bought in bulk, worked out to just a couple of cents per pie. 10 cents for a custard pie indistinguishable from one made with fresh cream, in a house with no fresh milk at all. Under $2 today for dessert that solved a problem most families faced at least once a week. Baked, the top of the custard turned a light golden brown, with a faint sprinkle of nutmeg visible across the surface, while underneath the texture was smooth and creamy, silky on the tongue, with no hint that the milk inside had come from a tin of powder rather than a cow. Custard pie with powdered milk tasted exactly like cream made from water and a tin of powder. Number 2 wasn't built by one family either. It was a wedding cake assembled from layers that arrived, one by one, in the mountains of eastern Kentucky and Tennessee through the 1930s. Weddings rarely came with money for a tall, fancy, store-bought cake, so communities built their own, not with frosting and tears, but with something better: cooperation. The stack cake, sometimes called a wedding cake of the mountain, was built one layer at a time by an entire community for a bride who might otherwise have had nothing at all. Each family in the community baked one thin layer of cake, a simple, Slightly spiced dough made from flour, sorghum, or molasses, ginger, and buttermilk, rolled thin and baked flat, almost like a large, soft cookie. There was no single recipe owned by one person. Nearly every household had their own version, passed down slightly different. On the day before the wedding, families brought their layers to the bride's home, where someone, often the bride's mother or grandmother, assembled the entire cake, spreading cooked spiced apple butter between each layer, stacking them higher and higher, sometimes 6, 8, even 12 layers tall. The finished cake had to sit overnight, sometimes for a full day, allowing the apple butter to soak into the dry cake layers, softening them until the whole stack became moist and tender, almost like a single cake rather than separate layers. The cost to any one family was almost nothing. One layer made from ingredients they already had on hand. But the cost to the community, in time and care, was everything. When the cake was finally cut, each slice showed every layer, a cross-section of an entire community's contribution, each layer slightly different in color and texture from the next, all held together by dark, spiced apple butter. The smell, while it sat overnight, filled the house with apples and spice, getting stronger by the hour, building anticipation the same way the cake itself had been built, one piece at a time. A bride with no money for a wedding cake walked into her wedding with one anyway, built by hands that weren't her own, from ingredients that weren't hers either, assembled by a community that decided she shouldn't go without. There's a story, still told in parts of Appalachia, of a bride counting the layers on her cake the morning of her wedding, and realizing for the first time exactly how many families had shown up, not at the ceremony, but the day before, with a single layer of cake wrapped in cloth, set quietly on her mother's table. Not every wedding had a community ready to build a cake one layer at a time, though. Number one is for everyone else, and it starts with 2 of the plainest, palest rounds of cake you've ever seen. For families who lived in towns rather than mountain communities, without the tradition of a stacked cake, but with the same problem of no money for a fancy wedding cake, there was still a way to put something white, tall, and celebratory on the table. It started with the plainest cake in any cook's repertoire, and ended with something that looked, for one afternoon, like it belonged in a bakery window. The cake itself was simple: flour, sugar, butter, milk, baking powder, and egg whites only, since using just the white made the cake bake up pale and light, closer to white than the yellow a whole egg would produce. Baked in 2 or 3 round layers, it was nothing special on its own. The frosting was where the magic happened. A mother would boil sugar and water together until it reached the right stage, then pour that hot syrup in a thin, steady stream into egg whites, being beaten as fast as her arm could manage, continuing to beat until the mixture cooled and turned into a thick, glossy, pure white frosting, what was sometimes called 7-minute frosting, for the arm-matching 7 minutes of constant beating it took. The whole cake, 3 layers, fully frosted, cost about 20 cents, most of it the sugar for both the cake and the mountain of frosting it took to cover 3 layers completely. 20 cents for a cake that, once frosted, looked every bit as tall, white, and special as anything from a bake. Under $4 today for an entire wedding cake. Frosted, the cake turned bright white, with that boiled frosting setting into a glossy, slightly crisp shell over a soft interior, and the smell while it was being made was simply sugar, cooking down into something that would soon be spread thick over every layer, every side, every inch. An hour before, it was 2 plain rounds of cake and a pot of boiling sugar. An hour later, it stood tall, white, and glossy, wedding cake, because somebody decided it was one. With enough care, even the plainest ingredients in the house could become something worth celebrating. That was never about money. It never was. 30 desserts, 30 kitchens. Not one of them had a grocery budget that would survive a single trip to a modern store. And yet, every single one of these families had dessert, sometimes every week, sometimes only on the days that mattered, but they had it. That's the part we forget. We remember the Great Depression as a decade of going without, and in a lot of ways it was. But in kitchens across this country, going without never meant going without everything. It meant looking at vinegar, stale bread, or a single leftover potato, and refusing to let it be the end of the story. So here's the question. Out of all 30, which one would your own grandmother make? Which one sounds like something that was on your family's table, even if nobody ever told you the name? Pick one, just one. and actually make it this week, not as a project, not for a video, but because a woman who's no longer with us spent an afternoon making exactly that for people she loved with almost nothing. If this brought back a memory, subscribe. There are more of these coming every single week. And if you remember one of these 30 from your own family's kitchen, tell us which one and where you're from in the comments below. Make one of these. Make it for some. Make her proud.